Just as people are entering the Zoom meeting, I just want to bring greetings from the Department of Surgery. Welcome to our grant writing workshop. We've been doing this for the last several years, and we have a number of I think excellent talks, a lot of pearls and avoidance of pitfalls that we'll learn about this afternoon from varying perspectives. I'm Michael Failings, Vice Chair of Research in the Department of Surgery, and welcome. I'll introduce the faculty in a few minutes, but perhaps we'll ask our Department of Surgery Chair, Professor James Rutka, to make a few comments. Jim?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Michael, and greetings, everyone. And Michael and Val, thank you very much for organizing this session. You know, I wish I had something like this available to me when I was in residency and we had a chance to learn all about grant writing. Grant writing is essentially a sine qua non of research. In other words, you have to know how to write a grant and get funding if you're going to continue to do research in the academic setting, as we are at the University of Toronto. And I've been doing this, as has Michael, for me, over 30 years now. And I just submitted a recent grant to the CIHR this last cycle. And it just goes to show you that after all these years, you still need to know how to do this and continue to do it. And the good thing is you get better at it over time. And I know that the grants that I first submitted versus the grants that I'm submitting now, those grants in the early days pale in comparison to the ones I think that I'm submitting now, all because you get better as you get more familiar with the process and as your grant writing style improves. So there's no substitute for content, of course, but there's a whole technique of putting grants together that I think you're going to learn about in this Zoom webinar. And so as a result of that, I really want to thank Michael for putting it together and for organizing a great team that we have today of university speakers. We have speakers from our faculty and we have resident speakers. So Michael, thank you very much for doing this. And I look forward to sitting through the sessions and also continuing to learn myself. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you, Jim. And indeed, it's a learning experience for all of us, including myself. And I just want to also do a shout out and a big thank you to Val Cabral for helping to organize this afternoon. So we've got a series of talks, and I think what we'll do after each talk, we'll maybe take a few minutes of questions, and then we've tried to allot some open discussion time at the end. I would ask if people could perhaps put their questions into the chat, and then at the end, then we'll go into gallery mode, and then we can have a bit of interactive discussion. So I'd just like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Gulnaz Farhat, PhD, and she is the Strategic Research Development Officer at the University of Toronto in the Vice Dean's office in the Faculty of Medicine, and she'll give us some perspectives on how to write a persuasive grant proposal, and then she'll be followed by Dr. Alex Serrano, who's a Research Funding Awards and Honors Officer in the Faculty of Medicine as well. So Gulnaz, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. So thank you for having us. I'm just going to share my screen, and then Alex and I will quickly introduce ourselves. So just let me know if you can see.
Yeah, you're good.
You can see everything. Okay, perfect. Okay, great. So we've recently had a new addition to our office, in the Office of the Vice Dean, Health Science Education, Research and Health Science Education. Alex DeSerrano has joined. So now we have 2 people on board offering editorial support. So we're going to be doing this presentation together today. So just quick introduction. I finished my PhD in 2016 in medical biophysics here in the Faculty of Medicine. And then I did a little bit of research for a couple of years and then eventually transitioned into grant development and proposal editorial reviews. And I'll just let Alex quickly introduce herself as well before we go into the presentation.
Yeah, hi, I'm Alex. As Golna says, I'm relatively new. So I started in the office in November and just recently defended my PhD in October. So I had one of those really quick breaks and then started here. And so I did my PhD in evolutionary biology, but a lot of my research really overlapped with the health sciences. And then prior to joining the office, I actually used to teach grant writing in SGS to grad students, hence why I'm here today. Yeah, and then Golnaz will go first, and then I'll talk a little bit about that as well.
Great, thank you, Alex. So we're going to get right into it because we are on a tight timeline today. Okay, so unfortunately, there is no magic formula for writing a great proposal. I don't know if you guys were expecting me to reveal that to you, but it doesn't exist. However, today we will provide you with some general tips and strategies that can make your proposal more persuasive. So the good news is that proposal writing is a skill that can be learned. And once you become familiar with the fundamental building blocks of a good proposal, you will immediately be able to improve your writing, as Dr. Rutka said. So as with any other skill, practice makes perfect. And once you've put in the time and effort to write a good proposal, future proposals will come much more easily to you. So the first step to proposal writing is to recognize that it is a genre and it's very different from academic writing. So when you write a proposal, simply stating the facts is not going to be enough. You actually have to persuade your reader. So your goal in writing a proposal is to convince the reviewer that your project stands out from the others and that it deserves to be funded. So essentially, you're putting together a well-crafted and strategic sales pitch. So let's quickly look at how proposal writing differs from academic writing. So when you're writing a proposal, you're trying to be persuasive, not dispassionate as you would in a manuscript. You're selling versus explaining. It's forward facing because you're talking about work that has not yet been completed versus in a manuscript where the work is already done. And so immediately you have to be more convincing. So of course, since it's forward facing, you're writing in the future tense versus the past tense. You're going to have to use language that's accessible to a broad audience versus in a manuscript where if it's in a specialized journal, you can really use specialist language and very technical terminology. And of course, in a proposal, you have to make sure that you are addressing the sponsor's priorities because that's the person or that's the organization that will be funding you. So as you are planning and writing, keep in mind that the purpose of your proposal is to convince the reader of 3 main things. That your project will be original, so it's going to be innovative and it's going to advance your field, that it's important, so it's going to address a significant problem and bring significant impact, and that it's feasible. That's also really important. So given the time and the resources and your expertise, you're actually going to be able to pull this off. That's really important. But to effectively persuade, you need to know who you are persuading. So who is your audience? So your audience, obviously in this situation, is going to be the reviewer, the review panel. And right off the bat, you can assume that they're busy, distracted, tired, probably bored because they've read many, many proposals and yours may be the last one in the pile. And they're obviously going to be skeptical. So you really need to be able to convince them. But also you need to kind of assess or think about what is their area and level of expertise. Who are you writing to? So understanding your audience is actually the #1 issue in grant writing. That's one of the things that you have to get right. And you have to realize that almost all grant panels are very heterogeneous. So you're usually writing for intelligent researchers who are not necessarily experts in your area, but there may be 2 or 3 experts. So you're sort of writing for a broad audience. So essentially you're writing for 2 types of reviewers. You're writing for specialists who are researchers from your subfield with whom you share terminology and theoretical background, and generalists who are also researchers maybe from the larger field or even not from within your field. And so you have to be able to satisfy both of them. Your proposal has to be accessible to both of those audiences. So when you're ready to write your proposal, I recommend you start by defining your goals and your objectives, because they will provide a really good skeleton to build your proposal around. So you could follow this upside down triangle method, where you start broad and then you drill down to be more specific. You start first by summarizing your overall research goals. So that's the big picture. You'll obviously not address the entire goal in its entirety in one proposal, but reviewers like to see this because it provides context and perspective, and it gives them an idea of where you're coming from. Then you want to identify your objectives for this specific proposal and be clear on how these fit in with your overall research program. This defines the purpose of your proposal and indicates how you're going to fill that knowledge gap that you identify in the introduction. And it's really important because the reviewers want to see that there's a logical link between what you're proposing and your overall research goals. And then finally, identify your hypothesis, because this helps focus the research and also ensures that your specific aims are achievable, because you will build those aims to test that hypothesis. So here's an example of how to write out your aims, your goals and objectives following the upside down triangle I just showed you. So let's start from the beginning. Our long-term goal is to understand the molecular details of Coxiella burnetti's distinctive physiology and to apply this knowledge to developing novel therapeutic strategies. So the long-term goal is relatively broad. It's to understand, the overall physiology of this bacterium. This will not be addressed entirely in this proposal. Then we get more specific. So towards attaining this goal, the overall objective of this application is to identify metabolic pathways that are vital to C. burnetti's intracellular growth. Okay, so now we're drilling down, getting more specific with the objective that will be addressed in this proposal. And then finally, the hypothesis. Our central hypothesis is that C. burnetti evolved from a tick-associated ancestor by acquiring critical metabolic genes through horizontal gene transfer. So you see the hypothesis is now very specific. It helps to further focus the proposal, and that's what's going to be tested in the aims. So as you see, the goals and objectives are presented in a logical manner, going from very broad, becoming more specific. It's easy to see how the proposed work relates to the long-term goals of the applicant, and the hypothesis is very specific and adds focus to the proposal. So now you're going to want to write your aims. So these are the core of your proposal. So along with your goals and objectives, this is what's going to provide the structure of your proposal. So you want to write your aims so that they communicate what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. You give each aim an active descriptive title, which I'll show you in the next slide. Your aims should be related but independent, such that if aim 1 fails, you can still do aims 2 and 3. They should be specific and they should have a clear endpoint. And ideally, they should test a hypothesis, but if they don't, they should still accomplish an objective. And of course, they should be feasible within the time frame of the grant. So here's an example. We start here with a descriptive and specific title. So aim 1, to identify metabolic pathways that distinguish C. burnetti from tick-associated Coxiella. Very specific. I've seen a lot of aims that are written with very vague language, and this is much more effective. Next, we have, because Coxiella species present in ticks do not replicate within a lysosome-derived vacuole, our working hypothesis is that genes critical to C. burnetti's unique intracellular physiology will not be present in tick-associated Coxiella. So this statement provides a rationale and a hypothesis that can be tested in this aim. And then finally, we will sequence the complete genome of C. burnetti's closest known relative, a Coxiella species present in the soft tick Ornithodoros rostratus. And by comparative genome analyses, we will identify metabolic genes and pathways unique to C. burnetti. So this statement clearly indicates what work will be done and what approaches will be taken. In other words, it's the what and the how. So once you have your goals and your objectives well defined and articulated, you now have a really good plan, a skeleton around which to build your proposal. And so now that you're ready to start writing, there are a few elements that you should keep in mind as you write. So the first and most important is context. And Alex will focus most of her part of this presentation on context, so I'll just touch on it briefly. But also there's logic, specificity, and feasibility. These are all important elements that go into writing a good grant proposal. So if we start with logic, your proposal should obviously be logical and consistent. So When you're writing a proposal, you're doing a lot of convincing, and the best way to convince someone is through a series of logical and consistent arguments. So think of logic as a tool of persuasion. You want to appeal to the reader's sense of what is reasonable and logical, and each part of the argument should flow logically into the next. So make sure you check for inconsistencies or gaps in your arguments. When you have a break in logic, you can invite a lot of skepticism in the reviewer, and that could really ruin your chances of being funded. So just make sure that you read through your proposal and you ask others and even non-experts to read so that they can point out any gaps in logic. So some examples of things that I've seen an investigator ask for 2 postdoctoral fellows in their budget, but there's only 1 mentioned in the methods. And so it makes you wonder, what is that other one for? Or sometimes you see a sub-aim or an aim appear suddenly in the methods that was not introduced earlier on in the proposal. And then there may be gaps in scientific arguments, because as an expert, some things may seem really trivial and obvious to you, but that's not necessarily true for the non-expert. So ask a non-expert to read your draft to identify these gaps and help you write a proposal that's very easy to understand. Next, specificity. So this adds credibility. The more specific you are in your arguments, the more credible your arguments will be. So for example, this statement I see all the time in grant proposal: this research will have a meaningful impact on. This is essentially meaningless because there are no specifics in this sentence. Anybody could write this, and it probably is present in many, many grant proposals. The best way to go about this is to actually identify specifically what you're talking about. So instead, you could say, instead of this research, you could say identifying the metabolic genes unique to C. burnetii will provide us with, and then instead of meaningful impact, new therapeutic targets, and so on and so on. So immediately that just makes a more convincing statement by being more specific. Next, feasibility. So every good proposal is inherently somewhat risky. And so your goal is to reassure the reviewer that you can pull it off. So reviewers will look for signs of feasibility in a number of different places. So obviously in the project description, that's the most obvious place they'll look. Are your goals reasonable? Do you have preliminary data? Are your methods, have you provided good rationale for your methods? Is your timeline reasonable? Also the budget, is it reasonable? Does it align with your methods? Does everything make sense? But the last 2 blocks are where I find are the weakest in most proposals. And that's where you talk about the people and the environment. So you need to talk about the people who are going to be doing the work. What is their expertise? What is their track record? If it's a team grant, where's the evidence of synergy between these team members that shows that they're capable of pulling off the work? And then environment. Make sure you talk about the infrastructure that is available to you, the resources that are available to you, core facilities, instruments in other labs. Any of those things can add to the feasibility of your proposal. And so they shouldn't be forgotten. Okay, so now the most important one, context. So the definition of context is that it's the circumstances that form the setting for an event, statement, or idea, and in terms of which it can be fully understood and assessed. And that is what your reviewer is trying to do. They're trying to understand and assess your proposal. So providing them context helps them understand it. It helps them relate to the problem, which immediately makes them more likely to be interested. It makes your work relevant and current. And through storytelling, you can really play on the reviewer's emotions and engage them in a way that allows them to become your advocate when they go back to the review panel to score your proposal. So a word on storytelling, that's actually a really powerful way to provide context and to be persuasive in your proposal. So when you do that, the story is the concept that should underline the structure of the entire proposal. And so the clearer and simpler your story is, the more engrossing it'll be. And this way of providing context gives the generalist a context in which to understand the significance of the work, but it'll also be appreciated by fellow specialists. So I'll pass things on over to Alex, who will go into more detail about how to tell an engaging story.
Thanks, Golnaz. And I'm going to be asking Golnaz to advance slides for me. So could we go to the next slide? Nice. So I've provided, mostly for myself, a little outline of how we're going to talk about context and how it can be how you can use storytelling to make sure you're providing the information your readers need to know. So first, I'm going to go over a strategy for how you can tell your story in a compelling way. I'm going to show you an example that does this really well, so you can kind of see it in action. And then I'm going to give you some tips for how to tell your story concisely. And this is a lot to learn in like the amount of time that Golnaz and I have. So I'm also going to end with where you can turn if you want more practice doing these things. Okay, next slide. So I've stolen Golnaz's triangle from earlier, similar to how she's been describing it. The width of the triangle represents the breadth of your scope. Instead, though, this isn't just for the goals and the objectives. Pretend this triangle is now your first paragraph. Other than that, everything Golnaz said is the same. And as she mentioned before, the context, and here where the context is being told in the first paragraph, is the most important. So of course, the first paragraph, you want to be providing the relevant background information to set up your objective, your hypothesis, your goals, your aims. But importantly, it has to do more than that as well. So it needs to spur interest in your proposed project. If you do this correctly, it will instill sense of a problem, which will create a desire for a solution in your readers. Also, if you think back to that slide that Golnaz showed you that had the purpose of the proposal with the little Rick and Morty cartoon, two of the things that a proposal needs to do is it needs to convince your reader that your project is important and that it's novel or original. And your first paragraph really has to at least start touching on both of those things. Otherwise, your reviewer isn't going to get engaged. Next slide. And so I'm starting with the crime show one because I like crime shows, but also because crime shows do a lot of the things that you want to do with your proposal, and I'll explain. But first, I'm going to talk about crime shows because I like them. So pick your favorite crime show from Netflix. So they first set the stage. And so think, ooh, it's a dark and stormy night. There's a nefarious character afoot, and then blam, a crime occurs. So in this case, the crime is the problem. Something bad has happened. And the rest of the episode is spent with the protagonist trying to solve the problem. You get to the problem quickly, and then you care about it, and then the rest of the episode is spent solving it. Next slide. And surprisingly, proposals that are compelling and good at storytelling can kind of follow the same framework. So when you're setting the stage, here I call this surveying the territory, but you're providing the information that your reader needs to know to understand the problem. But you want to quickly get to that problem because that's what your reviewer is going to care about. And so here a problem is something that hasn't been investigated before. You've probably heard of a gap before. That's what a gap refers to. And then once you set up the gap, you state that your proposed project will solve this problem. Following that, you can get into the goals and the aims and the hypothesis as Golnaz described. Importantly, like a crime show, you want to get to that problem as quickly as possible because that's what your readers care about. And this is how you can basically use your proposed project as a solution to a problem. Next slide. So here I'm going to show you those steps and kind of show you how you can do this. And so I've used that same triangle from before, but I've put those 3 steps on the triangle. So you first survey the territory as quickly as possible. You identify a gap or a problem. You occupy the gap, and then this nicely leads into your objective and your hypothesis. Another way to think about your hypothesis, your objectives, is this is basically the thesis statement of your proposal. And you want to get here as quickly as possible because your thesis statement is the crux of your proposal and what your reviewers are going to care about. If you're thinking about a manuscript, you're probably thinking, oh, it usually takes several pages to get to a hypothesis in a manuscript, but manuscripts have an abstract. And while some grants do have an abstract, many do not. And so you do really want to get your reader to your hypothesis or your thesis as soon as possible. And so on this next slide, I'm going to show you an example. Oh, not yet, I lied. Okay, I'll go in this a little bit more detail and then we'll get to the next slide. So you can do next slide now, Golnaz. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about this, and then I will show you an example. So looking at the triangle, again, the width is the breadth. You want to start with a big picture. So what does big picture refer to? So usually, as Golnaz alluded to, it's an issue that your reader is going to care about. It will be dependent on your audience, but in general, big picture issues concern health, economic issues, environmental issues, societal issues. So something that your reader is going to connect with and identify with, and this can help them to care about your proposal as soon as possible, in this case, the first sentence. From there, you provide only what we need to know to understand the gap or the problem. You propose to solve the problem, and then you move on to your hypothesis. Next slide. So here's the example I thought was coming up sooner than it did. So this is the example I referred to earlier. I'm going to read this. It's a well-written example that really delicately shows those 3 steps. So as I'm reading this, try to think about the background information or surveying the territory, the step that identifies the problem or the gap, and the solution. And then when I'm done reading this, I'm going to get you guys to try to identify those different pieces in the chat so you guys can participate a little bit here. Before I read this, this is an example that was on a Writing Center website. And so the target audience here is basically you guys, it's students who would use a Writing Center at a university. So keep that in mind. All right, I will try to read this as the best of my ability. Okay, so stress is an ever-present factor in the lives of university students, many of whom have difficulty regulating stress and functioning to their fullest potential. Many individuals choose to relieve their stress by listening to music, and stress relief as a result of music listening has been researched through both physiological and self-perception studies. Music listening decreases physiological stress by indirectly decreasing cortisol levels, a hormone linked to high stress levels, through a downregulation of the HPA axis. Research has shown that adults who listen to music with the goal of relaxation find it significantly more effective in relieving stress than listening to music for the purpose of distraction, according to self-report measures. However, little research has been done to examine music's effect on the mental health and stress level of university students who may differ in their stress response relative to the general population. For example, because of the pressures of completing complex programs while living away from home. As a result, we designed this investigatory study to determine how undergrad residents at Conrad Grebel University College use music in relation to stressful situations and how stress relief through music listening is perceived. We hypothesized that students will report stress relief as one of the primary reasons they choose to listen to music, and that they will report choosing music they enjoy when they need to relieve stress. All right, so first I've highlighted problem at the top here, and so to refresh your memory, that's the gap. That's what hasn't been done before. So if you could in the chat, include maybe the first few words of the sentence that you think corresponds to the problem or the gap. And then following that, I will discuss that further. If you can. If that, okay, I got one response. Anyone else want to put the first few words of the sentence they think corresponds to the problem? All right, that's cool. I can just talk about it. Next slide, Golnaz. So this sentence that starts with however, little research has been done, corresponds to the gap or what is not known. And so why is this the case? Well, we learn at the beginning that stress and music listening is used to relieve stress. The sentence prior to this describes that research has shown that adults can use music to relieve stress. But this sentence says what we don't know. So however, little research has been done to examine music's effects on the mental health and stress level of university students. And then the sentence continues on to say that university students may differ from the general population for XYZ reasons. So this is the gap in this, this project's information in this paragraph. Next slide. And so solution, I'll just go to the next slide to show you guys the solution, not make you work. So we've learned that the gap is that no one has investigated the effects of music and stress relief in university students. And so occupying that gap is therefore, because no one has done this, these authors are going to design this study that will actually investigate how university students use music to relieve stress. Next slide. And then I'm not going to surprise you with the background information, but obviously The background or surveying the territory provides just the information that we need to know to be able to understand the problem, as well as what the hypothesis is. And so by the time you get to the hypothesis, it shouldn't be a surprise to your readers. They should basically be able to guess the hypothesis before you spell it out to them. And this information in combination with the gap and filling the gap makes it so your thesis statement or your hypothesis is clear to your reader before you get there. Okay, next slide. Another thing that this piece of writing did really well is it used signals and cues for to help guide readers through the paragraph. And so I'm going to show you some different cues that were used for each step. So first, for surveying the territory. When you're surveying the territory, you're basically telling what is known in the field, background information. And so using cues such as an important issue is, researchers have approached it by doing, it is assumed that, tell your reader that you're telling them about the state of the field, so what is known. So an important issue in the field is blah, 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 tells your reader that they're learning about what is known. However, and I'm using one of these cues even when I'm speaking, words like however, yet, and despite this mean something contradicts what was said previously or is in contrast to what was said previously. So you're talking about what is known. However, this is what's not known. So even if your readers don't know these steps, when you use a phrase like however or yet, they know you're switching gears and are now talking about what we don't know. And finally, after you've said what the problem is, words like therefore mean for this reason or consequently. So this is what we know, this is what we don't know. Because we don't know this, I'm going to investigate this proposed project. So your readers now know this is why you're conducting your project, and this leads really nicely into your long-term goals and your hypothesis. Next slide. And I just wanted to show you that this example actually uses these cues, even though you might not have noticed it when I was reading it. So in the background information, which is in light blue, I've bolded the one phrase, research has shown. The authors say this, and we know that they're talking about the current state of affairs in the field. However, this is what we know. This is what we don't know. In this case, we don't know how university students use music to relieve stress. And finally, as a result, therefore consequently, because we don't know about stress relief in music in university students, we're designing this study. And again, for a short proposal, this can really help to guide your reader, and it's part of that storytelling to get them to actually see why your proposed project is important. Next slide. And I put this up mainly to remind myself to also show you guys that these authors are also kind of using this inverted triangle, and they're starting broad and becoming more narrow as they get to their hypothesis. Next slide. And so, for example, maybe this text was a little bit too real because it's about stress in graduate studies, but the authors did this because it's something as a graduate student that you guys are familiar with and identify with. And so, yeah, stress sucks, and we want to avoid stress as much as possible. They then talk about music and its relation to stress relief, and each sentence gets more and more specific to the gap and the hypothesis. And so by the time we get to the hypothesis, we know all the information we need to know to appreciate why this hypothesis and this proposed study is novel and important. Okay, next slide. So for the last couple of minutes I have, I'm going to go very quickly over some tips you can use to actually start developing your story. And this is before you actually formally start writing. This is kind of in the brainstorming phase. And so the main thing you want to do, and Golnaz said this as well, is you want to work back from your hypothesis or your goals. Next slide. So after formally writing out your hypothesis, you can kind of ask yourself these questions and write out points that kind of answer these questions. So following your hypothesis, what is the most important gap or problem that your objective or hypothesis will test? Often when we're writing a grant, there's several little gaps that our project will address, but when you want to tell your story really concisely, like we've been advocating for here, you want to focus on the biggest, most important gap or problem. After you've written out your gap, you want to use the bare minimum information that your reader will need to know to understand your gap and hypothesis. One way to do that is to try to think of a big picture issue that's related to your project. So for the example I showed you, they used that stress is an ever-present factor for university students, which definitely is something that we probably can agree with. And then after you've connected to the big picture, look at your hypothesis. Try to think of all the information that your reader needs to go from that big picture issue to your hypothesis. And you want to make sure all the terms in your hypothesis have been explained, and that you're going from connecting that big picture all the way down to your hypothesis. And taking point form notes and doing that can be one way to really help to tell your story in a more concise way. Next slide. And so I'll conclude here. We just gave a very quick rundown of some strategies you can use to write grants. But as you guys are grad students through SGS, you have access to a lot of really great workshops through the GCAC. So GCAC stands for Graduate Center for Academic Communication. They have all kinds of workshop on communication, but I'm highlighting this one here on writing grant proposals. It's specific to CHR, but I mean, it's an important one. But also you can apply what you learn from that one to other grant workshops. It's hard to see, but registration for the first workshop this summer actually opens tomorrow. So this is good timing. And this first workshop runs from May to June. And if you find that that might be too early for you and you want some more time to think about proposal writing before you start, there's another one that runs in August. So you can just keep an eye on the offerings page from the GCAC. And the one thing I want to highlight is you can get feedback from your supervisor and your lab mates, and that's more specialist feedback, but it is harder to find generalist feedback. And if you take these courses, they actually have TAs who will give you a generalist, they'll like read your draft and give you generalist feedback. So it's one way to start practicing so you can start honing your skills now. So to kind of keep practicing and get better. So I highly recommend this course and other courses at the GCAC for if you want to actually get hands-on practice from generalist readers. And with that, I think that's our last slide. Yep. So thank you for listening. And then both of our emails are here. And I should have said this earlier, but we'll also share our slides. So you'll have access to our email and then all the other information that we talked about today.
Thank you so much for all the pearls, and it's great that you're open to sharing the slides. And Val, I think it'll be really helpful for us to send out kind of a post-meeting advisory on these other grant writing courses as well, because all of these different workshops provide kind of different perspectives. I didn't see any questions in the chat. Would encourage people as they're kind of thinking about questions to kind of pose them in the chat. But maybe just for sake of time, maybe we'll kind of move on, and then we'll have a kind of an open-ended set of questions in the end. So the next several talks will kind of provide some different perspectives on the tips for grant writing success. And the first a speaker will be kind of coming from the perspective of a senior scientist, a PhD health services researcher, and this will be Dr. Anna Gagliardi, who's a senior scientist at the Toronto General Hospital Research Institute. So, and I called you a senior scientist. I hardly think you're a late career researcher, but we'll call you senior scientist if that works. Then thank you.
Yeah, I think I've earned it. Lots of years of grant writing brings lots of wrinkles. Okay, bear with me one moment. Okay, that happened faster than I was expecting. Sometimes there's a bit of a delay. Kudos to the organizers of this session. I think it's really, really useful. As researchers, we spend a goodly proportion of our time writing grants, and it's an important activity because really all of us are kind of like running our own small businesses, and we need to keep that revenue coming in. So it's a constant activity. And while we do get better at it, we can always learn more to improve our grants and increase our chances of success. So I thought that I should provide everyone with a sense of the kind of research I do, because some of the tips that I'm going to be sharing may or may not be relevant to you depending on what kind of research you do. So I am a health services researcher. I specialize in something called implementation science. Really, that's all about trying to figure out where are there problems, what's causing the problems, and what are the solutions or the strategies or interventions we need to implement to raise awareness, improve knowledge, and modify behavior, all with a mind to improving quality of care and patient safety. And in more recent years, that's shifted to studying how to implement person-centered care for women across the lifespan and across many different healthcare issues or conditions. So again, in order to frame the advice that I'm going to be sharing, I thought that it would be good to get a sense of the kind of research I do. So here are three grants that I've recently received after what was a bit of a dry spell for 2 or 3 years, where I submitted lots and lots of grants, but kept improving them and resubmitting them. And here I am now with 3, luckily, very fortunate, with 3 research grants that I'm in the process of planning and launching. Just prior to that, here's some other examples of funded research to just give you a sense of where I'm coming from. So here we go. I think I have 11 slides. I won't be too long, really. Each of them includes just 2 or 3 quick points that I will make. 1, if you're starting out as a new researcher, newly writing grants, I encourage you to attend and observe peer review panels. As trainees or early career researchers, you are allowed to do that. I'm not sure exactly where you find the information, but CIHR panels will allow you to do that, and other funders will allow you to do that as well. It's so instructive to listen to reviewers discuss the strengths and limitations of the research applications they're considering. You'll learn a lot by doing that. Number 2, I've labeled start small. So by that, what I mean is look internally in your academic department, in the hospital research institute you're affiliated with, and find all the internal small grant opportunities that you can apply to. I mentioned a couple here that I was fortunate enough to get in my very first or second year of after becoming an investigator. I honestly don't know if they still are available, but look for those small opportunities to start building up your CV to prove to the peer reviewers who are reviewing your research grant that you can acquire research and bring that research successfully to completion. Number 3 is that even with those small initial grants, you may still have to do some foundational work to show that you've established a basis that now you are going to build on. So it's helpful to include some background research you've done in your proposals. And there are creative ways you can do that even without research funding. So there's a number of courses at U of T that are always looking for people who have research projects for 1 term, for a full year, for 20-month periods of time. In recent years, I've also been engaging Master of Public Health students from the various schools, McMaster, Western, Queen's, U of T, because they have to do a practicum work term between 3 and 4 months. And while it's ideal to pay them, because they have to do that work term to satisfy their degree requirements, even if you don't have funding for them, you might be able to get one of those very high caliber students. So there's a variety of ways that you can engage various types of trainees in helping you do that foundational work to convince peer reviewers that you have established the basis for your ongoing research program. Number 4 is that in addition to all of the great advice given by the first 2 speakers, where you really have to highlight why is your research important, it's always helpful if you can enhance the discussion of your topic to show that it is a very relevant, high priority topic. Often the opportunities you will be applying to may specifically have guidance documents that describe the priorities for funding. So it's important to tailor the way you describe your research to make it relevant to those hot topics or those priority areas. And I mentioned here that at some point in your career, you might actually need to just kind of shift what you're working on. That certainly happened to me early in my career. I was studying guideline implementation, and while clinical practice guidelines remain a pretty fundamental thing that people rely on to guide practice and policy, it became not fundable. So I had to sort of shift course, and hence why I'm studying implementation science, but in the area of women's health. Writing grants takes a lot of time, and to write a really excellent grant takes literally months. You cannot do this 1 month or a few days in advance of the deadline. You will prepare multiple iterations. You will improve it and improve it and improve it. You have word limits, so you might have 5-page limit. You might have a 10-page limit, and every single word counts because you have to pack a lot of information in there. So it has to read really, really well, and you must start well in advance of deadlines. You will not be able to submit a competitive grant that stands a chance of being funded if you're doing it last minute. Number 6, part of the reason why you want to start well in advance is to get a lot of feedback. Many academic departments or research institutes, the hospitals, have programs in place where you can prepare your proposal, submit it, and have some reviewers, and these are people who are not necessarily on your research team, review it and give you feedback. And it's really good to get a lot of eyes on it, a lot of different perspectives. It's amazing what some people catch and others don't. I find that when I send a proposal out to the people on my research team and to others, everyone catches different things. They all give you really useful feedback to enhance the quality of the application. I think formatting is so important. I've read, as a peer reviewer myself, many grants where there was 0 spaces in between any of the writing. So from the very first line to the end, it was just constant lines of writing. That makes it really challenging for the peer reviewers to read about it and to care about it. So in addition to wordsmithing, I encourage you to spend some time formatting it, put space between sections, add figures, really limit the number of acronyms you're using, include subtitles in the sections because they help guide the reader through the story that you're telling them. The formatting is really important to help the reviewer do their job. Another sort of pet peeve of mine, and something that I've noticed as a reviewer, is that some people will submit a grant and no one on the research team has expertise in either some of the content areas or the methodology that they are proposing they will use. That's a really red flag for feasibility. So for example, a lot of people might submit a grant that involves qualitative research elements and no one on the team has that expertise. I don't think anybody would do the same in an epidemiologic kind of grant where statistical expertise was required. So just make sure that your team has all the expertise required in terms of the content, the methodology. Something else peer reviewers will comment on is whether there are different career phases involved. So if you're a late career researcher, it's important to include early and mid-career people in your research. If you're an early career person, it's really important to have much more experienced people on your research team. It's also important to include trainees. You can include funding for trainees. It's also important now, at least in health services research, to engage collaborators, partners called knowledge users sometimes by some of the granting agencies, as well as either patient, family, or public members who are members of your research team as advisors. That has essentially become a requirement in health services research anyway. Pay attention to all required sections. So I've seen a lot of grants where a lot of effort was put into the background, into the methods, but not all the other sections that are required. So for CIHR, maybe some other funders, you may have to address how your research addresses sex gender-based analysis. So does it reflect diversity, risk mitigation? How are you going to translate these findings into either the next step of the research or into practice or policy? So pay as much attention to these other sections as you do to the methods. Because again, if they're not there, if you haven't left room for them, if you haven't carefully planned the appropriate content for those sections, those will be red flags. Those will be regarded as limitations of your research. Here, I'm talking about how you describe your past successes and why you're the appropriate person to do this research. So in academia, we are slowly starting to move away from scientists being assessed for merit based on only the number of publications and the impact factor of their publications. So here I'm reiterating the very important points made by the first two speakers, that you have to describe the quality and the impact that your research has had and will have. So what is novel about your research? What gaps does it address? And in particular, what are the concrete learnings or outputs or impact that you can expect? And as they said, do be really explicit about those things. And finally, my last slide, this is a screen capture of an article that I share with my research staff, with graduate students, and I myself look at it every once in a while when I've had a lot of rejections for either manuscripts or grant proposals. It's called Batting 300, which is a baseball thing. I'm not really a big baseball person, so I don't really know what 300 refers to, but I gather it's not so good. And so this research study surveyed or interviewed researchers to learn about how they manage to keep going. And the emphasis here is really that you just have to keep going and be persistent, be resilient, read the feedback you get, improve your grant, and continue to submit it until it becomes a fundable piece of work. That's it for me.
That's fantastic, Anna, and thank you for those insights. Let me just have a look here at the chat. So there's just a comment from a Catherine Howe. For observing panels at CIHR, you need to apply to the reviewer in training program, and it's a bit of a lottery. And Catherine has put the link into the chat, and then I think Val, Natalie, I think you might have to go to the operating room. Is that right? So maybe.
Yeah, sorry. It's the case.
Yeah, no worries, no worries.
I think Dr. Rudka has a question though.
Okay, Jim.
Yeah,
sorry,
thanks,
your hand up. Yep.
Yeah, thanks, Michael, and Anna. Thanks very much for your insights. And I also agree with you about having individuals review your grants, before you submit them. And some institutions are better than others at having like a formalized reviewer process. And at your institution, do you have that? And what could we do, for example, this is also for Michael in the Department of Surgery, to facilitate review of grants before they're actually submitted in kind? I've learned so much from the reviewer comments, but getting individuals, to what Golnaz and Alex were saying, who are specialists in your area, but then those that are generalists, are actually really important, because you can learn more almost from the generalists than from the specialists. Anna, what would you think?
Yeah, I would say it's an excellent program to have in place. It can be challenging though, because the people have to write their grants far enough in advance that it gives people a chance to review them and give feedback in a timely manner so that it can be incorporated. At TGHRI, it's been a bit patchy. because there's not always enough people to volunteer to do that extra reviewing duty.
Right.
And I would say that it's kind of fallen by the wayside through COVID, just because people have been exceptionally burdened on a number of fronts. So yes, it has been rather patchy, but I myself have made use of the service to have other people who are not necessarily specialists in my area do the
Yeah.
review. And that really reveals what things are not clear that really do need to be clear to any reviewer. So it's definitely a worthwhile
Yeah.
endeavor to try and implement, but not necessarily easy to implement.
Yeah. Thanks, Anne.
I agree with Dr. Rutka's point, though, that it is very helpful to, even if there's not a formal process to get grants reviewed, to have a senior colleague, even if they're not in your area of specialty. Sometimes it's just helpful to have a generalist review the grant, just to make sure that it's that it's clear. So let's segue to Dr. Natalie Coburn, and Natalie is a senior scientist at the Sunnybrook Research Institute and a surgical oncologist at the Odette Cancer Research Program at Sunnybrook. And she's going to give us some pearls on how to sell your story. And this will kind of, we're hearing this message come through loud and clear in different ways from the speakers. So, and Natalie, over to you.
So there we go. Sorry, I'm so sorry that I got stuck in the OR. So I knew I was following Anna, and I knew Anna gives such a great overview of everything that you need to know, and really down to the letter how to do this. So I wanted to give some thoughts on things that I knew she doesn't touch on. And I think what she talked about last, like the batting 300 and how you continue to go back to this over and over again is really critical, because that becomes important both in your grants and in your manuscript writing. And when I talk to the residents at Sunnybrook, I focus on this picture because it's a beautiful picture, but mostly because of the story behind it. So this is a photographer named Alan McFadden, and he thinks to get this one picture, he spent 4,000 hours and almost 1 million exposures on his digital camera to get this perfect shot. And so I always take this into consideration when I'm thinking about the grants and the proposals and all the writing and how long we spend on trying to get this most perfect shot and what we can do differently. And so I think Anna talked about this. This is really about telling your story, and you have to be able to explain to the reviewers who are probably not in your area. They're not cancer researchers if you're a cancer surgeon, and they're not neurosurgeons if you're a neurosurgeon. You have to explain your story of why your research is important and how you're going to improve things. And I think as clinicians, we really are very fortunate because we can do this by working with our patients. And I'd say the trajectory of my research over the past 15, 20 years has really changed significantly from something that I did because I thought that I could impact patient care and how patients do something where we sit down with the patients at the very beginning. So when we start thinking about a project and we start thinking about a grant, one of the first things we do is say, okay, how are we going to get some patients involved in this? Who is this going to impact? And how can we get them involved? And that is one of the metrics that CIHR is looking at for good reason. And they do want to see patient engagement. And I think it helps to ground scientists and clinicians and researchers, but also to get patients involved in creating their own story and creating their own outcome. So the recognized benefits are improved access to the healthcare system, trying to get the right treatment at the right time. Obviously, these are all really great clinical epidemiology outcomes. But I think that, device creation, drug creation can also involve patients because you could look at quality of life instead of survival as an outcome. And overall, this probably will improve cost effectiveness and the better delivery of healthcare to all of our populations. So it doesn't work easily, I will say, and there have been many times when we've tried to engage patients And obviously they're busy. They're busy being patients. They're busy having their cancers treated, especially for us, it's challenging. But even for some of our quality of life and some of our end of life stories and research, we've been able to bring the patient voice into it, which I think has helped us create better research to have better outcomes for patients. And I think it's really helped in terms of our grant capture. I think Anna talked about this, always get an internal review for your grant. And I say this for everyone who's starting out, because when you're starting out, this is what you look like. And the last thing you want to do is send it to somebody who's going to review it and tear it to shreds. But really, that's what you want to do. And the reason you do this is for a few reasons. Number one, it forces you to be organized. So if you have to send this to one of the senior members of your department, it really forces you to make sure you've got everything working well in advance of the deadline. And I think Anna probably knows the reason why the methods and the background looked really good and then everything else looked like they were done at the last minute is because they were done at the last minute. And so if you're forwarding this to somebody else in your department in order to make the best use of their time and to get the best information out of it, it does force you to be ahead of the deadline. And as she said, they always pick up something that's different and something that you hadn't really thought of and a little bit of an angle that probably you would not have thought about. And it is a good idea to send it to somebody who's outside of your area, because they're going to be the types of people who are reviewing. So maybe find a colleague in cardiology, find somebody you went to medical school with, somebody whose research is different enough that they're going to ask questions like, I don't understand why you're doing this. I don't understand what you mean, because there are big leaps of faith that you take in the grant because you're trying to squeeze it into 8 pages. And your reviewers don't always catch those leaps of faith. Read the fine print. The last thing you want to do when you're going through all of this at the last minute is go back to the CIHR webpage and look at the fine print. But realistically, what are the criteria for the grant? What's their scoring system? Because if they have 15% allocated for infrastructure at your hospital, and that was on page 9 and it gets cut, you may not get those 15% points. So if there's a scoring system, what are the keywords that they use? So if they use the keywords over and over again, invent the future of healthcare, you better believe somewhere in the grant, at least 10 times, I'm going to have invent the future of healthcare. If this is a patient-centric evaluation of outcomes across the province, if they're looking for representation across the country, you build your team differently. So look really carefully at what the criteria are for the grant and make sure you're playing to your strengths, because not all grants are going to be scored the same way, and you may have to beef up certain sections for it. Look for assistance with your own reference letters. How are you being judged? What are they judging you on? What are the criteria? Again, if you ask Dr. Recca or Dr. Failings, hey, can you write a letter for me for this grant? They're going to say yes. And then at the last minute, they're going to say, oh boy, what am I going to say about this person? And so if you say, dear Dr. Coburn, will you write me a letter? Here are the things that the grant is judging on. The grant is judging me on infrastructure at my hospital. Let me tell you the critical issues that Sunnybrook supports me in, so that you know this information for the letter of recommendation, so you can help with some of these things. Be really careful with your budget. This always gets left to the very end. You kind of have a concept in mind of how this is going to look, and maybe you have enough money, maybe you don't, but you do have to look at this a lot sooner, I think, than most of us do. Be aware that almost all CIHR grants have inevitable cuts. And then once you get the money, be really meticulous in record keeping for your budget. That's really easy to get that messed up your first few years in practice. Submit a lot of grants, and that's where the batting average of 300 comes in. We all know that 1 in 8 or 1 in 10 or 1 in whatever gets funded. So that means that for all of us that put in grants, 9 out of 10 of us are going to come home with a letter of rejection. And that's okay, because that's just the statistics. It's not a reflection of who we are or what we're doing. It's a reflection of the system. So don't be afraid, and don't be sad when you get the failure rejection letter. If you get the first grant you write and you submit it and you get funded immediately, and you got funded #1 in the class, either you got really lucky, or you may have spent more time on that grant than you actually needed to spend. So you probably could have sent it in a cycle or two ago if you got funded the first go round. So if you're spending that much time perfecting it to get it to rank first time around, you may have you maybe could have spent your time wiser. So don't be afraid of failure. It's not a sign that you're a bad scientist. It's just a sign that the system doesn't have enough money. These are some of the comments that I got for my first rejected grants. Read the comments. You know, you get the rejection letter. The first thing you want to do is close the rejection letter. What you really need to do is then sit down a day later with the rejection letter, maybe sit down with one of your senior mentors and say, okay, what are they trying to tell me here? So for my first rejection letters, research was not well focused. They were correct. Too little support for clinical duties. This is a group of surgeon scientists. There is a feeling in granting agencies that surgeons and clinicians often don't have enough time or enough support. May be true. Prove them wrong. Say, I am a clinician and this is why this makes this important. I have direct access to patients. I know exactly what the outcomes are that I'm looking for. And so that's why I, as a clinician, I'm going to do a better job with this than anyone else can do. And by the way, my group is awesome. There's 17 of us. I only take call 1 in 17. I don't take weekend, I'm supported in the following ways. They give me salary support. So you can see the themes. Can a surgeon actually run a research program? Hopefully, yes. My CHR grant, not enough support from other team members. They are correct. Too little money budgeted. They were correct. Too little time budgeted, and they were correct on that. So often the reviewers are on to something. So listen really carefully when they say things to you. Sometimes they just miss what you've already explained. And that becomes very frustrating because the cycles are long and you go, I explained the sample size calculation right here. I explained this part of the methodology that they questioned, but at least that's very easy to address on the next submission. When you're looking at this, as Anna said, do a literature review first. That shows the grant reviewers that you are really serious, and show that you know your material. And you think of the reviewers as kind of omniscient people. They actually don't probably know you at all. So you really have to show that you know your material and say why you are the person to be running this. And so I got one comment back that said, although the PI is well published in gastric cancer, her background in pancreas cancer is unclear. Which really took me aback until I realized that they had asked for the CV for the past 3 years. And so the only publications that they saw in the package were gastric cancer publications, because that's what I just published a whole lot about. And so the pancreas stuff that I had done kind of got diluted out and really wasn't that clear. So they were correct on that. And I could have fixed that by saying, although a lot of the publications recently are in this, I also have a strong background in that. And here's the information to back that statement up. Lots of people get rejected, a lot, for lots of different reasons. And clearly these were very successful people. J.K. Rowling, everyone knows, was not published over and over again. Walt Disney lacks imagination, has no good ideas. Elvis was told to be a truck driver, and Michael Jordan talks about how he has taken the game-winning shot and lost it so many times and failed over and over, and that's why he succeeded. And I think that's really an important thing to think about for grant writing, because it's not often that you get it the first go round and you have to put it back in again and again. And it's that drive that's really important in making sure that you keep your team and your career and your trajectory funded. So that was kind of my counter to Anna's comments, because I knew she would cover all the critical issues. Most importantly, just enjoy what you're doing, and that will show through in your work. All right, whoops, and you're going, don't need to see the clinic list there. All right.
Well, thank you. And, you know, your comments about not being discouraged by failure is important, because one needs to develop a thick skin, but also to learn to take advantage of the grant reviews, and to try to kind of focus on those as well in a positive way, for sure. I think you know, to your point around the kind of the CV piece, increasingly you know, grant agencies will want the grant writer to try to provide commentary or synopsis on the research contributions. So this becomes really important. So for a lot of American agencies, they want an NIH kind of mini bio. So there you have an opportunity to summarize that, but also CIHR is now kind of wanting that, where you kind of put it together, those publications. Any comments or other reactions from the audience? Okay. Well, Natalie, thank you. Good luck in the OR. We'll maybe carry on, and then we'll have some discussion toward the end. So
Let's see what they're doing. I'll check in on them and see.
Okay. Okay. Very good. Yeah. Thanks a lot. I certainly can empathize. Okay. So to bring a resident's perspective, we have Dr. Hala Muadi, who's a PGY4 general surgeon. She'll be talking about grant writing a resident's perspective. So look forward to your comments, Hala.
Hi, everyone. I'm Hala. I'm a general surgery resident, and I just completed my SSTP CIP training. So I just wanted to, this is probably more applicable to the residents who are in the group and who are interested in, or who are applying to grants. And certainly I have no conflicts of interest, and this is really just my own perspective of how I view the whole process of grant writing and why, or what approach I've taken. And I apologize if I look like I'm half asleep. I had a long weekend of call, and we're down to several residents. So I ended up taking a lot of extra shifts, and we were operating all night and all day. So just to give you a little bit of perspective on why this is, or why I'm giving this talk, or why, just to believe maybe a little bit of the information that I'm giving the residents here, I have been successful in a number of applications and a number of grants in the short time that I was in my SSTP training. And this is basically the awards that I was successful in the last couple of years. So by no means was this like you know, it's not a fluke that I guess I got that I got these awards. There's certainly, I think, a process that I sort of followed and was helpful for me in the grant preparation. So I think the way I looked at it was more like a 3-step process for me. It was a contemplation followed by preparation, and then followed by preparing your application. So I say contemplation because I think I'm the type of person who likes to think about these things. And again, like, this was helpful for me. It doesn't mean that it's going to be helpful for everyone, but this is sort of the process of thought in my brain, at least, that how it worked out for me. I started with my first step, which is contemplation. And this is really like when I first found out that I'm successful or I'm going to start my SSTP training. By SSTP, I mean the Surgical Scientist Training Program. I started by figuring out what are all the lists of things that I can apply for, whether it be broad or short. It's just the general gist of everything that that is applicable for me, that I can really submit an application for. And I compiled a deadline of all these applications, and I definitely made the mistake one year that I did not look at the applications deadlines because they keep shifting. So after you find those grants that you want to apply for, don't take it for granted that you're going to be around the same time. I think one of them, I think the CIHR masters shifted by a good like 3 months or something that I just did not know. And I scrambled like last minute basically to submit or start my application and also submit the application in time. After the contemplation phase for me contemplation took me a while because I just wanted to, make sure why I'm applying to these grants. And I also talked to a lot of people who applied to grants and what grants they applied for. A lot of the process, I think, when you start this SSTP is filled with intimidation a little bit by what you're going to do and looking around you at what other people have done. And at least for me, I was quite intimidated initially by asking questions and by sort of approaching other people who are successful and asking them why they've applied to things and what they have applied for and when they've applied to specific grants. And I encourage all of you to sort of try to overcome that step, at least the first one where you're a little bit intimidated about approaching other people, and just go for it. This is your dream, this is your ambition, this is what you applied for, this is what you've been working so hard for. Just ask, just approach people, ask them. Nothing's gonna happen. You may take advice, you may get some information that you're not agree with, but it's fine. At least you've asked and you've collected all the information that you can collect. The second step was preparation. So after I looked at all of these grants, it's important to review the grant requirements. I don't know if it's just me, but I probably have done this at least once where I went through the process of preparing an entire application and asking for recommendation letters. And just before I hit the submit button, I realized that I needed to be in training for over a year, and I was just like missing it by a month because of the cycle that we start in when we're in SSTP, and that completely disqualified my application. They wouldn't even look at the application, they wouldn't even want to review the application, and it was a wasted time and a wasted effort for me. And I say wasted because every grant requirement is a little bit different than the other grant requirement, and you may spend some time collecting information, filling out applications, just your mental energy is taken up by applying for one grant that may not necessarily have the requirements that, or fulfill the requirements for other grants that you're applying for. Then I really approached my supervisor. Some supervisors are more hands-on and they might be helpful actually in the first step, the contemplation step. Mine was just a bit hands-off, so I felt that it was easier to come to him towards the end of the process where I sort of have the grant, know what I'm applying for, know where the deadlines are, and know what I think I wanted to do. But it's important to take their perspective because they've seen way more than you have seen, and it's helpful to know what their thoughts are on the process and why they think this grant is helpful to apply for at this stage or not. And honestly, ask people. Like, I think I've emailed one person out of the blue one time. She was a plastics resident. I've heard her talk and I saw her name that she's applied and gotten CHR, and I just sent her an email. I want your advice. Can you talk? Can you meet? And I just met up with her and I got her perspective about the grant applications and what she went through and what she had. And again, like, don't get intimidated. I think I got really intimidated after I spoke with her, and I was like, okay, I'm never gonna get a grant in my life. That's it. Like, I shouldn't apply. But don't be. You all have your strengths. You all have the reasons why you're in this program and why you were selected to participate and why your supervisors picked you and why you're in medicine, why you're pursuing this grant specifically. So it's good to ask and it's good to talk to people, but don't be intimidated by other people's experiences if they seem like they're a little bit more than what you thought you would be able to perform or do by this point in your life. And then comes the application process. So I can't emphasize how early you have to start. I think every year I wish I had started earlier, because there's always a lot of work to do and there's always more people that you can ask for opinions. And I encourage, again, like what everybody else has said, to send your application, send your statements, send your proposal, send it to everybody who's on your committee, send it to everyone you could think of that would give you feedback. It's really, maybe it's impressive what some people see that you don't see, what other people didn't see before you who read the grant. And people catch things, people don't catch things. People dedicated different amounts of time on reading your material, and send it to them early so that you have time to fix it, change it, maneuver it around, do whatever feels right to you. Ultimately, this should be a reflection of you and why you're doing this project. And I think I'm focusing more on a reflection, which I'll go into it in the next slide, because a lot of the components that you'll be writing have a personal statement about your goals, your objectives, and why you want to do this. So ultimately, all of this has to come across in your personal statement, especially for the CHR grants, the PSR grant. They really, I thought that that's what got, I mean, maybe not, but I felt that that was an important part of why I got there and why I got those grants. And be ambitious. Like, I never thought I was going to get all these grants that I got, and I never in my life thought that I would be successful in any of this, but I did, and I was ambitious. I applied and I got it, and it's important to not be intimidated and just to apply, put your application out there. You never know what you'll get back, and you'll never know until you receive. And I don't think this is going to be a problem for all of you, really, all of your ambitious, I'm sure. And the reason why I say be realistic and selective, which sort of contradictory to the fact of being ambitious, is because, especially in the first year when you're starting out and you want to do a PhD, for example, and your options are to apply to CHR Vanya versus CHR Masters, and you don't have a lot of experience basically from before in writing or grants or applications or awards or anything that might help them see that, okay, you're successful, and that's why you can apply to something a little bit bigger like the Vanya or the PhD. Start with a small one, start with a master's. It's okay, there's always going to be time to apply to the other ones once you have shown that you can be successful in one. It really opens a lot of doors up for you to apply for the rest. And the reason why I say you have to be selective, because you can only apply to one. Your application won't be moved forward, I think, if you apply to both, and you have to select which one you apply for. But double check this information, because I think it changed and there was some contradictory information about it before. But generally speaking, they want to apply to both, to one only. So it's important and it takes time, like it takes time for people to read your application, it takes time to write your recommendation letters, and it takes time to cater your personal statement depending on what you're applying for. Like a CHR cares more, a Vanya cares more about your leadership skills and you as a person and what your journey has been, versus the CHR PhD is a completely different, I thought, personal statement for me. It was a little bit more focused on my academic curriculum and why it was a little bit more, I felt more academic in its focus. And again, this is my own impression. I am not an expert, but it's just anecdotally from my experiences and from what I've seen others do. And part of the last step is to make sure you review your requirements. And I put those out there because those are like the general gist of the requirements that can be a sort of cross applicable to many of the things that you could be applying for, at least the big grants that you could be applying for. Most of them request official transcripts. I think there are different ways of getting official transcripts now, but I think I was a bit old school and I didn't know that there's something called PDF transcripts now. So just have a hard copy with you. Ask for it. It doesn't take a long time, but just ask for it early, because sometimes they might need it, they might request it depending on what you're applying for. So just as soon as you start your SSTP, just submit for your official transcripts, ask for them. I encourage all of you to start submitting or filling out your common CVs now. If you don't know what I'm talking about, just Google common CVs and start filling it up now. It's cumbersome, but it's required for almost all the CHR applications, and you'll need it for future grant applications anyway when you're applying. So just start filling up the boxes or whatever the requirements are now to the best of your abilities. Your project proposal, I honestly don't have anything more to add aside from what has already been said about how to write a project proposal. I think I've honestly learned the majority from attending all of those seminars that were given. Like, I attended every single CHR seminar, every single CHR working shop, regardless of whether I was going to apply to a master's or a Vanya. I just collected all the information early on and I just attended them. And I think some of them have if you attend the workshop, they can go over your they can go over your project proposal, and those are people who are not in your field. And I just took full advantage of that. It's offered through U of T. You'll get emails about it through the SGS. And then I found them at least helpful in making sure that my project proposal made sense to somebody who's not in my field at all. And then some of the applications ask for something like a training environment, and make sure, and I pull on some of the things that have been said already, like when you're writing these training requirements and the personal statements and the training environments, you have to show why your training environment stands out. All of you, if not most of you, if not all of you, sorry, are probably going to be at academic centers where there is a research institute where your supervisor has been working with a couple of other people who are successful in their field, if your supervisor is new, just build on that and draw on that and put it in your application, put all the names of the research institutes. Those are, whether we admit it or know it or not, are going to be helpful in your application, because I mean, even I don't know how to say this aside from putting it out there, like you are in U of T, and U of T has one of the best research training programs worldwide. And just by stating those, at least making the reader or the reviewer know that you're aware of those, and you can use those resources as helpful enough to making sure that your training environment stands out compared to everybody else. And mention your team, whoever is supporting you, whether it's somebody who you see every day, whether it's somebody who you're going to see once a month, or it doesn't matter. These are all people who are going to be supporting you throughout your application. And I encourage you to think broad when you're writing your training environment statement. And I think sometimes the training environment statements, I think most people thought that, or most people rely on the supervisor to write it, and maybe that's the right way to do it. But personally, I wrote my own personal training environment statement, and I gave it to my supervisor for him to edit and add or remove whatever he thought. But ultimately, it's your grant application, and you're the one who's most invested in it. And you're going to be the one who's going to think about all these things that are going to make you unique and stand out compared to everybody else. Your recommendation letters, ask for them early. Make sure when you ask for them, you probably all know this by now, but make sure when you ask for them to have something already, sort of kind of a skeleton of something written out to help whoever is writing your letter focus on these things. Like sometimes we needed to ask our program director for letters. My program director is not heavily focused in science or research or anything. And I found that it's much easier for me to tell him what I needed him to say, or have a skeleton of what I thought would be helpful for my application, than to give him a blank statement of, I'm applying for this, can you please write me a personal letter or a recommendation letter. It's hard for someone who's not invested as much as you are to invest in your recommendation letter. And I say this all with all kindness. Everyone is so busy. Everyone has so many other competing and conflicting demands and multiple other recommendation letters to write. Help them by telling them how you stand out and why you want this and why this is important to you, and what they should highlight. It really does help, and it makes your recommendation letter stand out as well. Your personal statements will change based on what you're applying for. And I think, again, it's important to have other people read it, because you want to come across as professional, dedicated, ambitious, humble, considerate, like all of the qualities that you somehow want to convey to somebody who's never met you, who's never going to meet you, that you actually are deserving and worthy of this award and going to make good out of this award. Ultimately, they're willing to invest in you. They just want to make sure that what they're investing in is going to result and be given to somebody who's going to be doing good in it. And I think that's where a lot of us will come in your personal statement, whether this is for the venue or whether this is for something else, like for the CHR Masters or for the PhD. Ultimately, it's about drawing on your strengths and why this is your journey and why you want to be on this journey and how this journey is important for you. And I think that's all I have, really. Yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say. And again, this is my residence perspective. It's just my own experience and anecdotal experience of what I've been through. And I'm happy to chat to any of you about this in the future. And if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to meet with you, talk to you, email you, whatever you think would be helpful for you.
Dr. Mawadi, thank you. Lots of pearls there. I think one of the messages there is lots of preparation. For sure. Maybe in light of time, we'll just segue to Dr. Catherine Howe's talk, and then we'll go into a discussion period. And Catherine will be presenting kind of her tips and pearls kind of from the perspective of an early career clinician scientist, and perhaps from a translational basic science perspective.
Guys, I'm hoping everybody can see. Stop me if you can't. Nice to meet all of you, and I'll try to keep this nice and succinct, just so in the interest of time. Bearing in mind this is a bench researcher that is sitting here in front of you today, and I'm sure that you can pull some of the pearls that I'm trying to offer for whatever domain that you work in. Just a quick introduction. I am a vascular surgeon, so this screen is really just to highlight that there's a lot of different procedures we do, a lot of different organs that we work on, and the common denominator amongst all of them is that every single blood vessel is lined by an endothelial cell, and specifically a layer of endothelial cells that form like essentially a boundary between the cell contents that live below as well as what's flowing in the blood. And this becomes pertinent later, so that's why I'm giving you this highlight. Clinical training, bench research training, and some global health training. I'm giving you, again, just this snapshot so you realize that I've had different career paths that I've been a part of already, and there's been some winding turns. And it does play into part of what I want to talk about later, which is a toolbox. And so I'll just highlight the bench research training. My PhD with Derek McKay was actually in intestinal disease, and specifically looking at intestinal epithelial function. Phil Sherman was an extension of that, but I got into some hypoxia reoxygenation or ischemia reperfusion research. And Nick Leeper at Stanford really was honing in on some of the atherosclerotic research that's come to fruition today. Really, I'm going to highlight that I think trying to get at that first question is, what is the question that you want to answer, and what is the problem that you want to solve? As you mull this around, a lot of this probably speaks to what you've already heard, the idea of contemplation, and you've probably already had some of them brewing in your mind as you go through your PhD or your master's. Think about what tools you already have, and this speaks to why I gave you that slide a couple of slides ago. You know, you may actually pull some of your ideas from other experiences that you've had in life, other research experiences, conversations, even maybe a rotation on a different clinical service, and these are things that might begin to spark an idea that at least then turn into something that might be pretty big later on down the road. So just bear in mind that you may already have tools that you aren't thinking that are at your disposal. Which ones are within your reach? So are there tools that you're sort of at least comfortable enough with to talk about, but you know you might want to get some additional training? And then are there a stretch set of tools? So things that you know you don't know, but you think you need them to answer your question, and can you support the accomplishment of grabbing these tools through collaboration with experts? And so again, I really highlight that part of this is looking comprehensively, not only within your own research domain, maybe not even within your clinical experiences, but think about books you've read, think about places where you've had an idea pop into your mind, and often they come, as you know, when you're not actually expecting it. And so this is a highlight to really get at what I was describing for you. And I want to link one connection for you here. This is looking at a layer of cells that live at an interface. And so in the vascular system, these are cells that line every single blood vessel. And in arteries, we talk about a fast flowing lumen where the contents of the blood are streaming on by. And below the endothelial cell layer, you have a host of other cells that live there normally and get recruited in as a response to potentially inflammation or activation. And so then there's this concept that you've got cells living at an interface. And the reason I'm highlighting this specifically is that this idea that I pulled around a question that I wanted to ask, which was whether or not endothelial cells could communicate in a bidirectional fashion, meaning that can they connect and communicate differently in their apical or luminal space versus what they want to do with the cells in the vessel wall below. That idea was not new in my mind. That idea I'd already been experiencing and thinking about over and over again in a totally different system, in my intestinal epithelial research paradigm, where you have a very similar interface. You have cells that live, again, at this boundary layer, where you've got a very active dynamic environment with bacteria, digested contents, et cetera. And below that, you have a vessel wall, or a cellular wall, if you will, that has smooth muscle cells, nerves, and several immune cells. So that toolbox that I'm referring to was really my previous PhD experience, but had me thinking questions that to date, you don't have a lot of endothelial biologists ever thinking, and certainly not getting at intercellular communication in the context of atherosclerotic disease. And so as you start to have your idea and you think you're honing in on something, talk with senior colleagues, talk with mentors, talk with students. This is the early phase of it. I think it's helpful really, and the pandemic's not helped with this per se, but try to sketch your ideas out, sit together and go through the idea together, drawing them out, flushing them out, and pay attention to the reaction and the comments that are being given to you by your colleagues and your mentors and your students. They're going to be picking up on what's novel. They're going to be picking up on what might be worth pursuing. And so these are critical moments and experiences for the idea to be refined. And really you want to determine whether or not the idea is original, whether it's plausible. You want to determine whether the idea is relevant to the field, and you want to think about how this will advance the field. Again, all of these things that I've listed here are entirely in line with what you've heard tonight already from several other speakers about what you're going to put in that grant. And the idea is part of the nuts and bolts that get you to the grant later. Is it a relevant question? Well, you know, as a surgeon scientist or a clinician scientist, you probably have an opportunity to consider a concurrent translational component. You don't necessarily, at least in a bench research environment, have to spend 10 years on a very reductionist approach and then later try to translate that into a tissue specific question and ultimately realize, oh geez, you got to go back to the drawing board. So try to come up with something that might be a concurrent translational component. And if you're going to do that, start looking at whether or not there's a biobank that you have access to within your institution. If there isn't, is there a way for you to start up a biobank? There's certainly a lot of interest right now as you try to bridge PhD scientists with surgeon or clinician scientists, and we can be that interface. And lastly, there are well-established biobanks. So look in your field and see if there are specific elements of the question that you want to address and answer, whether that can be done through collaboration. I knew long ago from my time at Nick Leeper's lab at Stanford that there's a group in the Karolinska Institute that have a really, really well categorized tissue bank for carotid endarterectomy specimens. And oftentimes, including Nick Leeper, one of my scientific mentors, would specifically pose a question. They would say, yes, we can give you an answer to that. And this group would actually put together your figure, and there you go. You've got a collaboration with tissue-based data that goes into your paper. And this has been a successful collaborative approach that many labs have done worldwide. The proof ultimately is in the model, and some of this gets at the feasibility term you heard earlier. So think about the model that you're going to use in a bench research environment. There are going to be a few, and none are going to be perfect. So try to come up with what you think is the best one. Importantly, be able to defend them, or at least provide adjunctive ones that you think are going to help enhance why this model is important in getting at the root of the question you're trying to ask, and also then the answer you're trying to come up with. You need to be able to show preliminary data, but you also want to make sure that upfront you shut down any potential questions about the model being used to address the question. Think like a reviewer, be skeptical, be exhausted, think about what they're reading at the end of the day, and make sure that you've addressed any potential concerns upfront. So it's not at page 9 of your grant that you finally alleviated that concern that they've had. And that suggestion I'm making for you right now is entirely coming from all of the times that I've submitted my grants to various individuals, both in and outside the field, to get their opinion and their feedback. And some of these statements are nuggets, and they are what I've tried to put on these slides for you today. And so one of them is getting at the idea that there are limitations of the model, and you do want to find a way that you can demonstrate to the reviewer and prove to both yourself, obviously, before submission, as well as to the reviewer that it works. And all I'm showing you is that on the far left, part of it is a protocol that we used with lots of data that supports that we've got the extracellular vesicles that we're interested in. We have a middle figure here that I'm trying to highlight, us showing that we haven't actually got completely disrupted barrier function of the endothelial cells after activation. And importantly, one of the big questions that you might get at if you're thinking about endothelial cells in this interface is that if you want to look at very tiny nano-sized particles, you need to make sure that they can't just be leaking through or between the cells. And so part of this was making sure we set up an experiment where we used a gold nanoparticle that was the size of the smallest possible extracellular vesicle and ensured that we didn't have this leaky effect going in the model system that we were using. Make sure that your story is compelling. I think you've heard some really great suggestions already tonight. Certainly when it comes to bench research, but probably all research, it can get heavy and very detailed. Reviewers, as you know, are exhausted. They're reading on their limited time. And so give them something that captivates them up front. Help them understand why your idea matters. If there's a statement of the problem that you want to make, there's a novel paradigm that's really great to try to offer because that really helps sell them on the novelty. And something that I heard from an important review that I did with another mentor was the idea of putting a graphical overview on the first page. This mentor did share with me that while they didn't find this routinely being seen on CIHR grants, they sat on several NIH grant panels and noticed that this was a common successful approach being used in the States. And one of the reasons that they thought was behind this was in fact because they were more willing to put the belief in their story upfront on that first page, whereas a more Canadian approach can often be to kind of wait and sell it over time. And so in fact, on my successful grant application, I had literally 2 days prior to submission done a revision where I made sure to have a graphical overview on the first page. And I'd like to think it maybe did help at least seal in the reviewer's mind what it was that I was trying to tackle and what it was that I wanted to show them throughout the next 9 pages. I think this statement I want to highlight to you: know your tissue, know that what it's worth. Tissue really can be key. And I say this knowing that several of you are surgeon scientists here. So I had senior mentors commenting that when I had some of the earlier versions of my CIHR grant, that I was maybe underselling the significance of the access to tissue and the fact that I was already using it in the laboratory for some of our preliminary data. The take home that I took from that was for me to know that this is a highly, highly valuable commodity. And it's not only about the precious access that we have to tissue, especially if we've established the biobank and are helping to govern access to those tissues, but also the clinical insight. And that pearl I sort of acquired by sitting on grant panels and realizing that the things that I was commenting on and noticing within the grant applications as we discussed them was that I was one of the few people sitting on that panel that actually had clinical insight. It could speak to the specific clinical problem that these PhD scientists and sometimes clinician scientists were writing about for their topic. I think we sometimes take it for granted that everybody knows what we know, and they don't. So know your worth. And lastly, I would like to highlight that, part of this is about trying to bridge, if you can, the basic science with translational research, and have even within your grant this idea of a bridging concept, so that even if you have two somewhat parallel research questions that you think can dovetail together, help them see why they fit, so that you really can support the bench research, more reductionist approach that you want to be part of your grant, help them really see the exciting potential of that with some early work that you might be doing on the translational side. Lastly, you've heard this over and over again, but I just highlight again the importance of having a different lens, not only at the time of reading the grant, but this is really about even for the idea generation and letting the idea evolve. Discuss the idea as it's evolving in your mind with scientists that you know and trust in other fields. For me, as I mentioned, that I was fortunate, I had people within the GI field that knew nothing about vascular disease or atherosclerotic disease, but understood what I was getting at conceptually. And certainly, if I was able to convince them of the importance of what I was going after, it was a good start. And really, I can't emphasize enough, of course, the importance of discussing your ideas, even as they're developing, with a range of people that actually know the field, so content experts. But these aren't just limited to junior and senior colleagues. Talk with your students. From a junior to a more senior student, you've got people that are in the mix. They're reading every single day about the topic, and they're going to have insights that you won't necessarily have. And so just don't underestimate the value of all these conversations. Lastly, manage your expectations. It's a process. A one-page proposal can often be a way to help to distill down the idea. And I did this at the very beginning when I was fleshing out my ideas with some of my senior mentors. I can't stress enough again about having experts and non-experts in the field reading and going through your idea with you. And be efficient, because really these early tri-council grant attempts, they're a good chance for process. Manage your expectations and know you're likely not to get it the first time around, but look around and see if there are some of the other awards or grants that you can be applying where you take the frame that you've already generated with your CIHR grant proposal and you extract a good portion of that and make it efficient use of your time, where you then submit for different grants that are around the same timeline. And in fact, this can be really helpful, because you may in fact be successful. I was certainly with one of mine, and you will find that as you then continue to evolve the tri-council grant, that it gets better each time, and you'll see the difference as it goes forward. And so I just leave you with the idea that you're all sitting in a really unique position. You're uniquely positioned to discover, to translate, and to transform. But keep all of this in mind as you try to come up with both the questions that you want to ask, as well as the problems specifically that you want to solve. And I'll just leave it with that, showing you that there's lots of different things you can pursue. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Catherine. So, wow, we've had a lot of different perspectives. So why don't we kind of open this up for discussion, and maybe we can kind of get into gallery view, and if people want to put a question into the chat, that's cool. Or if you want to raise your hand, Dr. Rutka.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Yeah, I have a question first for Hala, and then after Hala, for Catherine, who just presented. So, for Hala, how important do you think it is to have your supervisor kind of review your proposal or help with the writing of the proposal? Because it sounds like you did this pretty much on your own, and there would be other labs where it might be a different kind of scenario. So what do you think?
I think it depends on your on the resident student's comfort level. I think we all come into this at different stages and different places in our life. I certainly think your supervisor should read 100% what you're doing and what you're applying to in your proposal. A lot of it comes from, or at least it depends on the supervisor, of course. Some are more hands-off, some are more hands-on in terms of feedback and rewriting and rephrasing. I think my supervisor wanted to see in general how I grew and how I matured and throughout the whole process, and some might adopt that approach as well. And that's why I found it very helpful to circulate this on a broad, like I sent it to all my committee members, and whoever didn't respond, but at least I felt like I did everything that I could do for my own success. And I had no regrets afterwards if I didn't get an award that, oh, I wish I had done this or I wish I had done that. I felt like I truly, truly have pulled on all my strings, done everything that I could do. I think the nice thing about having it circulated on your supervisor is that it stimulates that early, just it has consolidating your research project as well. And that's why, honestly, if you start early writing your proposal, it will really help you not only frame your it'll help you move forward with your project and sort of have a defined goal and objectives of what you're trying to do. So I really encourage all of you to start the process early and start that discussion early and limit it to one page. I don't think anybody will. I think most of the applications are one-page proposals, so you don't need more than a page.
Great,
And then
thanks,
you can
Hala. And
always
then,
add and remove as much as needed. Sorry.
no, perfect. And I mean, I think it's important for the residents to hear that because some may select for supervisors that are like really hands-on, and others prefer an approach where you're putting the majority of the effort into it and getting just supervisor blessing afterwards. And for Catherine, and this actually will, I think, be another question that Anna could answer too, which is, and maybe from the University Central, is grant renewal, right? So we didn't really talk about what it takes to get a grant renewed. And it's, you've got I think, Catherine, you got your first CIHR not too long ago. So are you already thinking about your renewal? What's that going to look like? What are you doing to prepare for that? How difficult is it after you get, I mean, it's a great feeling, as you know, to get that first CIHR grant. It's also a significant challenge, but it's even perhaps a better feeling when you get that renewal notice for your grant. So some comments, Catherine, as you're thinking about that?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. It is rewarding. You get about one day of excitement and then you immediately realize the clock is ticking. And so, yes, I have already thought about the next grant that I want to be writing and thought about how do I strategize that? Because of course you need preliminary data for some of that. And part of it is making sure that you actually have, as I've now sat on the grant panel reviews, they are closely scrutinizing what you've done during the years that you held the grant. So there's no point in writing another grant until you've actually gotten your papers out. And that's the hustle right now for me, because we have two major ones that need to come out hopefully within the next 6 to 8 months, which we're on target, I think, but it's really making sure that I've done some of the check marks so that they'll even consider whatever grant I put forward. The ideas that I want, I would like to obviously extend my current work. So that's kind of where that idea of renewal is there, where, it might be getting at the more mechanistic element of this bi-directional communication. And so we have already been lining up, or I have been lining up a PhD student that will come and take on that project now. So we have early overlap. But the other part that I want to get at are those new ideas that you, of course, never stop having. And how do you approach then a grant that you want to launch into another new idea? And that's where, again, starting to think who in your lab can start to chip away early to start to ask some testable small hypotheses so you can get some preliminary data and generate some of that grant. But I know that when I start putting together the real thoughts, it's going to be a good year away, but it's going to be several years in advance of the deadline so that I've got the framework and I'm not racing to try to put that together, because I'm pretty sure that the second grant is going to be even tougher than the first to get.
Yeah. Thanks, Catherine. Anna, any comments on the renewal piece?
In health services research, we don't really have renewal grants per se, but I think the same concepts apply. We complete that work promised for that particular grant that we got. And then based on the findings, we develop a whole new from scratch grant to do the next step in the process, depending what the findings were. So some of the points that Catherine made are relevant to health services research as well. Something that came to mind, though, as Catherine was answering that question, is the idea of like, how far off the scope of your research do you stray in order to get research funding? And I don't think that's something that came up in any of the presentations. So I think this happened to me early in my career, where I was just trying to get some funding in, and so I submitted grants for things that weren't really my core research in order to just bring some funding in. To some degree, that's not a bad thing, because while you're doing that, it gives you some resources that you can hire staff and they can help you continue to do the work, which is your core research. But the downside of it is that you're stretched too thin doing too many things. So it really is good. It's not always possible earlier in your career, but to start thinking about what are you really interested in, and really focusing on following that trajectory through your initial grants and your subsequent grants.
Great, thanks, Anna.
I had a question for Gulnaz and Alex. And this kind of relates to a concept that kind of was in both of your presentations, around trying to tell a story to maybe to try to capture the essence of the importance of the message. So I just wonder if maybe you might want to elaborate a little bit further on that. I think it's a powerful concept, not always so easy to do for people that are kind of more scientifically oriented. So just would be interested in your thoughts and perspectives on that.
I can start, and then maybe Alex, you can, if you want to add anything. I mean, the idea of the story is about the fact that you're presenting an idea that's very complex, very technical, and you need to find a way to make your reviewer relate to your very complicated proposal. And so that's really what it's about. It's to engage them and to get them interested, and to get them so engaged that they want to go back to that review panel and advocate for you. And so that's really what it is. You want to, as Alex said, you want to put it in terms of things that people can relate to: health, socioeconomic impact, economic, policy, that kind of stuff, so that somebody who's not necessarily an expert in your field can feel that they can relate to it, that it's important for them, and therefore now they're willing to, first of all, read further down into all the nitty-gritty and the technical areas of the grant, and actually pay attention to understand what you're proposing. And so that's what's behind the whole storytelling thing. It's just a tool, a mechanism to engage people and get them interested and ready to go to bat for you at the review panel.
And just to add to that very briefly, I kind of went over steps you can use to tell a story. You don't have to, but they're good because they touch on a lot of the things that the other panelists were talking about as well, in terms of what's the gap, like what do we not know? Why is your project important? Why is it novel? And I think if you can explain your research to someone who doesn't know it, and to someone in your lab or one of your colleagues that does know it, I think you're in a really good place. And that's at least one framework you can use to start achieving that.
Great, thank you. And I think one of the other messages that kind of came through loud and clear is the amount of preparation and work that's required to do it, to doing this. So I think that's quite clear. I thought that one of the tips that you, Catherine, had around preparing a one-page synopsis to begin with is one that I also use when I put a grant together. And it's actually a little bit of the opposite of how I write a paper. I usually write the abstract last when I'm writing a paper, but when I'm putting a grant together, I often write the summary first to try to figure out the goal and the hypothesis and kind of the kernels of how to do it. And then I think if I've got that, if I have that right, then I can kind of build the grant off that. I'd be interested to hear what others think about that. Now, maybe I've got it all wrong and that's not the right way to do it, but that's sort of one of the tricks that I've used to write grants. Be interested in. It seems, Catherine, that that's kind of what, if I heard you correctly, that's kind of what you were perhaps suggesting. And it's a nice way to communicate that with others as well, you know, because when you're kind of seeking out collaborations, just kind of interested in what others kind of think in terms of some of the tricks. I don't know, Anna, if that's something that you have done. Kind of
precisely what I do, actually. It helps me consolidate what I'm thinking the grant should focus on, helps me be really concise and clear when I'm forced to fit the ideas into one page in terms of what I'm trying to achieve. And I do that for all my grants. And precisely as you said, that way I can share that one page with the people I hope will be my co-investigators, with my collaborators and partners, so that they don't have a big document to review. They can very quickly see what the idea is and sign on if it appeals to them.
I don't know, Jim, like, what are your tricks? You know, you're such an experienced grant writer yourself. So when you're putting this, and you know, you're a very experienced author, but what are your tricks? So do you start with kind of like this kernel and build it out, or how do you do that?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. And you know, I really appreciated what Golnaz and Alex presented. And it's really great for the residents to hear that, because that's a fantastic template that you can build all your grants around, and it'll hold you in really good stead. So that inverted pyramid, I might actually start at the very bottom of it, just as I'm thinking it, like, what is my hypothesis? Like, we're scientists and we're doing hypothesis-driven research, so I might want to make sure I've got my hypothesis down, and then the specific aims of the grant, and then, you know, building the background around it, and also, you know, what are the gaps you're going to fill? Kind of what I would envision doing. And then I'm also very interested in how you're going to present your data, because it's the data that, you know, will tell the reviewers whether you've got a good idea or not. And the preliminary data, of course, is extremely important. I try to create some excitement within the grant so that even the most experienced specialist in the field can understand that this is potentially worth funding. It's a really good concept, good hypothesis. But also the person who knows the least about it can grasp it and understand it. So reducing it to the most simple terms, but not having you know, the science left out of it, but including it. And that's a real talent that takes time to figure out, is how to make it really good for the specialists to understand, but also good for the generalists to appreciate. So it's an art. It takes time, but those are some of my things that I would do, Michael, to try to get my grants funded over the years. Yeah,
thank you, Jim. You speak obviously from a wealth of experience. So we're going to be Val, I think we're going to be podcasting this, right? We've taped this, is that correct? And then we'll be making the you know, the PowerPoints and so on available. I thought that we should do a separate shout out though for the webinars, the lectures that Golnaz and Alex mentioned in their lecture, because I thought those were helpful. And Hala, you had mentioned that you attended like basically everything that you could get, and I think that's I think that's the case because like I always find that I get something else out of these talks, and sometimes you're tired, or your attention wavers, or your experience evolves, et cetera, but I always find that you pick up different pearls from different people, and sometimes hearing these things over and again is very important. Well, okay, so we're just over time, so I think we're going to draw it into conclusion. So I just want to thank all of the speakers very much. Extremely thoughtful presentations. Really appreciate the effort that went into your presentations and the time that you have taken. Appreciate the residents that have attended, and I realize that many have not been able to, but we'll podcast this and we'll disseminate the information. And a big thanks to Jim for his support of our academic work through the department, and a big, huge thanks to Val Cabral, who pulls all of this together. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a good evening. Take care. Bye-bye.
Night. Night, Jason.
Good night. That's everything. We're all good.
That's it.
Awesome.
Thank
All
you.
right. Have a great night. We'll see you
too.
again. Soon, I'm sure.
Sure. Yeah. Soon. Yeah. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.